Niccolo Machiavelli is one of history's most talked about figures, but for many, his name conjures only a single, often sinister, idea. People still repeat the line, "The ends justify the means," and associate it immediately with him, often as a condemnation. In this deep dive, we will follow Machiavelli from his beginnings in 15th century Florence through the world he lived in, the choices he made, and the profound, sometimes troubling, legacy he left behind. We will see what that sentence really meant for Machiavelli, and for the life he actually lived, revealing how one man became both an icon of ruthless power and a prophet of practical politics. If you enjoy long deep dives into lives and stories like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. Our story begins in the year 1494, when the vibrant city-state of Florence experienced a dramatic upheaval. For over 14 years, Niccolo Machiavelli had served the Florentine Republic with distinction as a diplomat and government official. His roles included traveling to the courts of France and Germany, negotiating with powerful figures like Caesar Borgia, and organizing the city's militia. He was an astute observer of human nature and political power, dedicating himself to the republic he believed in and for which he worked tirelessly. However, that entire world collapsed when the powerful Medici family returned from exile and overthrew the Republican government. Overnight, Machiavelli found himself unemployed, dismissed from all his posts, and viewed with suspicion by the new rulers. His brilliant career, built on service to the Republic, was shattered. This abrupt fall from grace left him in a desperate position, effectively exiled from public life to his small family estate just outside Florence. In this forced idleness, grappling with the humiliation of his dismissal and the financial insecurity that followed, a powerful need arose: the need to regain relevance and secure a return to public service. It was out of this personal crisis, this desperate yearning for employment and usefulness, that he began to write a short handbook on political power. This was not initially conceived as a timeless philosophical treatise, but rather as a practical job application, a letter of introduction to the new Medici rulers. Within the pages of what would become known as The Prince, Machiavelli laid bare the stark realities of acquiring and maintaining power, offering unvarnished advice on effective governance, sometimes regardless of traditional morality. His objective was clear: to demonstrate his invaluable knowledge of statecraft and persuade the Medici that he was indispensable to their regime. 5 centuries later, that slender handbook born of personal desperation has transcended its original purpose, shaping the minds of revolutionaries and tyrants, presidents and popes. From figures like Napoleon Bonaparte and Otto von Bismarck to leaders of modern nations, The Prince has been read, studied, and often misinterpreted. It stands as a foundational text in political philosophy, influencing countless individuals who sought to understand the mechanisms of power, both for good and for ill. The text became a mirror reflecting humanity's persistent struggle with ambition and authority. Despite the monumental impact of his work, Machiavelli himself died believing he was a failure, never knowing he had created the most influential work on political thought. He yearned to return to the political stage, to serve his beloved Florence, but he never truly did. He remained largely ostracized, his genius unrecognized in his lifetime, forever striving for a position that remained out of reach. This poignant irony sits at the heart of his legacy. Ultimately, Niccolo Machiavelli did not intend to become the most misunderstood and controversial political thinker of all time. His writings were pragmatic observations on the art of statecraft, rooted in his direct experience and his profound concern for the stability of Florence. However, his advice, often stripped of its context and purpose, gave rise to the term Machiavelian, a pejorative word suggesting cunning, deceit, and moral opportunism. His intent was to offer practical counsel, yet his name became synonymous with a ruthless pursuit of power, a profound disconnect between the author and his enduring reputation. His intent was to offer practical counsel, yet his name became synonymous with a ruthless pursuit of power, a profound disconnect between the author and his enduring reputation. This chasm between man and myth originated not from a calculated desire to shock, but from the stark circumstances of his own life and the desperate gambit he made to reclaim his position in society. For 15 years, Niccolò Machiavelli had been a pillar of the Florentine Republic. He was a brilliant diplomat, a keen observer, and a shrewd administrator, rising through the ranks to become the head of the Second Chancery and secretary to the Ten of War. His duties were manifold: negotiating treaties, organizing militias, reporting on foreign courts, and advising the Gonfaloniere, the chief magistrate of the Republic. He traveled extensively, meeting kings, popes, and emperors, honing his understanding of human nature and the intricate dance of power. He saw firsthand the fragility of states, the ambition of princes, and the fickle nature of fortune. His reports back to Florence were masterpieces of succinct analysis, devoid of sentimentalism, brimming with pragmatic insight into the realpolitik of Renaissance Italy. He was at the heart of Florentine governance, dedicated to its republican ideals and its continued independence. Then overnight his world collapsed. In 1512, after decades of exile, the Medici family, backed by Spanish forces, marched back into Florence. The Republic fell, and with it, every official associated with the previous regime found themselves out of a job, stripped of their influence, and often their freedom. Machiavelli was no exception. He was dismissed from all his posts, forbidden from entering government buildings, and exiled to his small family farm in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, just outside Florence. The humiliation was profound, the idleness crushing. Worse still, in early 1513, he was falsely accused of conspiracy against the newly restored Medici rulers, arrested, tortured on the rack, and imprisoned. Though eventually released due to lack of evidence and a general amnesty celebrating the election of a Medici pope, Leo X, the experience left him physically scarred and deeply embittered. Unemployed, discredited, and living in forced rural obscurity, the brilliant diplomat who had once stood at the crossroads of European power found himself a gentleman farmer with nothing but his sharp mind and vast experience. This was not merely an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. He yearned for the intellectual stimulation of political life, for the opportunity to serve his beloved Florence once more. He believed his unique insights, forged in the crucible of real-world statecraft, were invaluable. Desperate to regain relevance, to prove his continued worth to the new Medici regime, he embarked on a project during the long, quiet hours of his exile. This project was a short, sharp treatise on political power, an instruction manual for rulers, which he began writing in the summer of 1513. It was not intended as a grand philosophical work for the ages, but rather as a highly practical, almost clinical distillation of his 15 years of experience. He poured his observations, his analysis, and his candid advice into its pages, detailing how princes acquire, maintain, and lose power. The dedicatory letter, addressed first to Giuliano de' Medici, and then, after Giuliano's death, to Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger, openly stated his intention: to offer his knowledge and experience as a gift, hoping to earn a position, however humble, within their administration. It was, in essence, a very elaborate and utterly unique job application. "I wish your magnificence would accept this small gift in the spirit in which I send it," he wrote, "and if you read and consider it diligently, you will discern in it my extreme desire that you reach the greatness fortune and your other qualities promise you." He longed to be called back into public service, to advise, to contribute, to escape the suffocating quiet of his farm and the sting of unappreciated talent. He never achieved this goal in his lifetime. The Prince, circulated in manuscript form among a small circle of intellectuals, did not immediately open the doors to power he so desperately craved. While it generated some discussion, it failed to secure him the coveted position he sought from the Medici. He spent the remainder of his life in a frustrating state of semi-retirement, occasionally undertaking minor diplomatic missions or historical commissions for the Medici, but never regaining his former influence. He died in 1527, believing himself a failure. He had witnessed the sack of Rome, the renewed expulsion of the Medici, and the brief restoration of the Republic, but his personal fortunes remained bleak. He passed away, likely from an intestinal ailment, at the age of 58, never knowing that the small gift he had offered as a plea for employment would, within decades, be printed and circulated across Europe, becoming one of the most influential and controversial works ever written. 5 centuries later, that handbook, initially a personal petition, has profoundly shaped the minds of countless leaders, revolutionaries, and tyrants, as well as statesmen and presidents. From Napoleon Bonaparte, who reportedly annotated his copy of the Prince, to the architects of modern nation-states, to revolutionary figures seeking to seize and consolidate power, its stark insights into human nature and political necessity have resonated across eras and ideologies. Its principles, often misinterpreted as a blanket endorsement of amorality, have been invoked by figures as disparate as Oliver Cromwell, Otto von Bismarck, and even some of the founding fathers of the United States, who wrestled with the practicalities of establishing a stable republic in a dangerous world. It has informed academic discourse, military strategy, and countless works of literature and philosophy, perpetually sparking debate and reinterpretation. The irony of Niccolò Machiavelli's legacy is profound. He did not intend to become the most misunderstood and controversial political thinker in history. His personal aim was pragmatic, to restore order and stability to Florence, a city he loved and whose republican values he championed, even when advising princes. He saw the world not as it ought to be, but as it was, and he sought to arm rulers with the tools to navigate its treacherous waters, to maintain their state, and to ensure the well-being of their people. His writings were not an endorsement of evil for its own sake, but a sober recognition that in a world populated by imperfect humans, conventional morality could sometimes be a fatal weakness in the face of ruthless ambition. He believed a prince must be prepared to learn how not to be good when circumstances demanded it, not out of malice, but out of necessity for the greater good of the state. Yet, despite his underlying intentions, his name became a byword for unscrupulous cunning. His clear-eyed analysis, devoid of the moralistic platitudes expected of political discourse, was shocking to his contemporaries and remains unsettling to this day. The very directness of his counsel, his separation of ethics from effective governance, led to an enduring caricature that has overshadowed the complex figure he truly was. He was a patriot, a scholar, a man of letters, and a diligent servant of the Republic. Yet his greatest intellectual contribution earned him posthumous infamy while failing to secure him the simple job he desperately wanted. The man who wrote a practical guide to power, born of profound civic concern, died believing himself a failure, utterly unaware that his small gift would become an immortal, inescapable force in the annals of political thought, cementing his place as one of history's most compelling and perpetually debated figures. As their influence grew, a new and radical perspective on leadership began to take shape, one that challenged the very foundations of traditional morality in governance. This viewpoint argued that the psychological requirements for effective rule extend far beyond simple moral flexibility or ethical relativity. It suggests that what constitutes virtue in a leader is not the conventional kindness or honesty, but something far more demanding and perhaps uncomfortable for many to accept. To succeed, a leader must first cultivate what thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli termed an accurate understanding of the nature of men. This concept is central to his political philosophy, suggesting that all effective statecraft begins with an unvarnished view of human psychology. It is not about judging humanity, but about observing it with cold, precise calculation, stripping away all romantic notions or wishful thinking about how people should behave. This crucial understanding means seeing people as they actually are, rather than as we might wish them to be, or as abstract moral theories might dictate. For Machiavelli, most individuals are inherently self-interested, fickle, ungrateful, prone to deception, and motivated primarily by personal gain and security. To ignore these fundamental human traits is to build policy on sand, dooming any enterprise to failure. A wise leader does not preach to an ideal populace, but maneuvers among real people with all their inherent flaws and strengths. Indeed, many political failures throughout history can be traced back to leaders who projected their own values and ideals onto others, mistakenly assuming that everyone would act with the same principles, loyalty, or rationality. Such leaders, blind to the true incentives driving human behavior, often find themselves betrayed, undermined, or simply ineffective. They misunderstand that the world of power operates on different rules than the world of personal ethics, and confusing the two can lead to catastrophic results for the state. Therefore, truly effective leaders are those who grasp that different people respond to different incentives, and that successful states are built by responding to these variations in human nature, not by attempting to force everyone into one rigid moral mold. This means understanding when to use generosity, when to employ fear, when to keep promises, and when to break them, all guided by the ultimate goal of maintaining the stability and security of the state. This adaptable, pragmatic approach, rooted in a profound if cynical understanding of human nature, became a hallmark of Machiavelli's controversial advice for rulers. The psychological requirements for embodying this Machiavellian virtue, distinct from conventional morality, go far beyond simple moral flexibility or ethical relativism. It demands a profound psychological fortitude and a rigorous intellectual discipline. It's not merely about being willing to bend the rules. It's about possessing the insight and strength of will to discern when and how to bend them, and to face the often unpleasant realities that conventional morality seeks to avoid. First and foremost, leaders must develop what Machiavelli called an accurate understanding of the nature of men. This is the bedrock upon which all effective statecraft must be built. It means seeing people as they actually are in all their complexity, their selfishness, their short-sightedness, their capacity for both great good and profound evil, rather than as we wish they were or as moral theory says they should be. It requires stripping away the comforting illusions and the self-serving narratives that often cloud judgment, demanding an unflinching gaze at the raw material of humanity. Machiavelli observed that men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, avaricious. And while he acknowledged exceptions, he insisted that a ruler must always assume the worst and prepare for it. To operate on a different assumption is to court disaster. Most political failures, Machiavelli posited, result from leaders who project their own values, their own sense of honor, their own rational calculations onto other people, and assume that everyone else operates from the same principles. A ruler who is inherently honorable might assume his allies will uphold their treaties out of a shared sense of duty, only to be betrayed. A leader who values peace and prosperity above all else might fail to understand the deep-seated grievances or thirst for glory that drives an adversary. This projection stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the diverse motivations that drive human action. It's an act of intellectual laziness, a comfort blanket that shields the leader from the harsh truths of the political arena, but ultimately leaves them vulnerable. They construct policies based on an idealized citizenry, only to find them crumble in the face of human reality. Effective leaders, therefore, understand that different people respond to different incentives, and that successful policies must be tailored accordingly. Some individuals are moved by appeals to their patriotism, others by the promise of personal gain, still others by fear of reprisal. A general might inspire courage in his troops through a rousing speech about glory, but also ensure their loyalty through regular pay and severe punishment for desertion. A ruler might pacify a rebellious province through judicious acts of mercy, but simultaneously build formidable fortresses to deter future uprisings. This requires a nuanced understanding of various social strata, regional differences, and individual personalities within the state. It means recognizing that what works for the nobles might not work for the common people, and what motivates one faction might alienate another. The ruler's task is akin to a master craftsman, understanding the grain and properties of different woods, shaping each with the appropriate tool to achieve a coherent and stable structure. This dispassionate observation of human behavior also extends to the leader's understanding of themselves. Machiavellian virtue requires not only an accurate assessment of others, but also a brutal self-awareness. A ruler must recognize their own weaknesses, their own biases, their own emotional responses, and learn to master them. To allow personal feelings, be it anger, compassion, vanity, or fear, to dictate policy, is to invite instability. The successful prince must learn to wear many masks, to adapt their persona to the demands of the moment, to appear pious when it serves, or ruthless when necessary, all while maintaining a core inner focus on the stability of the state. This internal discipline prevents the leader from falling prey to the very human failings they observe in others. For Machiavelli, this accurate understanding of human nature, stripped of moralistic pretense, was not an endorsement of amorality for its own sake, but a practical necessity for survival. He argued that if a prince always acted good in a world where so many are not, he would inevitably be ruined. The world, as he saw it, was too dangerous a place for a naive ruler. To be perpetually honest in a world of deceit, or perpetually merciful amongst the cruel, was to sign one's own death warrant and endanger the state one was sworn to protect. Therefore, the prince must learn how not to be good when circumstances demand it, and to use that knowledge judiciously. This wasn't a call to embrace evil, but a recognition that the tools of governance must include the ability to navigate a morally ambiguous world, making decisions that are often difficult, sometimes distasteful, but always aimed at the greater good of the state's preservation. This perspective challenges the very foundations of traditional ethical thought, which often presumes a universal moral code applicable to all individuals and all situations. Machiavelli instead posits that political ethics are distinct from private ethics. What might be considered a vice in a private citizen, e.g., deceit, cruelty, might, under specific circumstances, be a necessity or even a virtue for a ruler responsible for the welfare of an entire populace. The weight of that responsibility, for Machiavelli, fundamentally alters the moral calculus. The prince is not judged by the purity of their intentions or the consistency of their moral character, but by their ability to maintain power and secure the well-being of the state. If a lie prevents war, or an act of cruelty prevents widespread chaos, then from Machiavelli's perspective, these actions are justified, even commendable, within the political sphere. Furthermore, Machiavelli delves into the psychological interplay between a ruler and their subjects, particularly regarding the emotions of love and fear. He famously argues that it is better for a prince to be feared than loved, if he cannot be both. The reason is rooted in his cynical view of human nature. Men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared, for love is preserved by the link of obligation which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails. This isn't an arbitrary preference for cruelty. It's a cold, calculated assessment of human reliability. Love, he suggests, is fickle and contingent on the ruler's continuous benevolence, which may not always be sustainable or strategically wise. Fear, on the other hand, is a more constant and reliable motivator, a deterrent against rebellion and disloyalty that stems from a deep-seated human desire for self-preservation. However, Machiavelli also immediately qualifies this advice, adding a crucial psychological nuance. The prince must ensure that this fear does not devolve into hatred. To be feared without being hated requires careful management of power and punishment. A prince should never seize the property of his subjects, nor violate their women, for these are the acts that breed indelible hatred. People can forgive the death of a relative, but they rarely forget the loss of their wealth or the violation of their honor. Therefore, while fear is a necessary tool, it must be administered with a surgeon's precision, focusing on deterring harmful actions without alienating the populace entirely. This delicate balance to instill fear but avoid hatred is another testament to the psychological complexity Machiavelli demands of his ideal prince. It requires immense self-control, empathy, albeit a strategic, not emotional, empathy, and a profound understanding of the human psyche's breaking points and enduring resentments. This concept extends beyond simple law enforcement to the broader psychological management of the populace. A wise prince understands the power of perception and reputation. They cultivate an image of strength, justice, and occasional mercy, not necessarily because they embody these virtues perfectly, but because projecting such an image maintains public order and dissuades both internal and external threats. The appearance of virtue can be as potent, if not more potent than its reality, as long as it achieves the desired political outcome. This highlights the performative aspect of rulership for Machiavelli, where the prince is constantly acting a role, adapting their public persona to the needs of the state. The prince must also be psychologically prepared for solitude. The burden of ultimate decision-making, often involving choices that compromise conventional morality, inevitably isolates the ruler. They cannot afford to operate based on personal friendships or loyalties if these conflict with the state's interest. Advisors are necessary, but the ultimate responsibility and the coldest calculations rest solely with the prince. This requires a strong sense of self, an ability to bear the weight of difficult choices, and a resilience against public opprobrium, all while remaining focused on the singular goal of state preservation. It's a lonely path, demanding a psychological robustness few possess. In essence, Machiavelli's virtue is a psychological profile demanding supreme adaptability, ruthless pragmatism, keen observational skills regarding human nature, profound self-awareness, and an iron will. It's a demand for a leader who can detach themselves from conventional moral sentiment to make decisions solely for the enduring benefit of the state, even if those decisions are unpopular, controversial, or personally repugnant. This isn't a call for nihilism, but a deeply practical, if often unsettling, framework for political leadership in a dangerous world. His principles force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, human behavior, and the often unavoidable compromises inherent in maintaining order and security. After his initial work, Niccolo Machiavelli did not simply choose between a princely or a republican approach to governance permanently. Instead, he sought to understand the enduring principles of effective statecraft, transcending specific political structures. His insights into military affairs applied equally to a strong prince defending his domain and to a robust republic maintaining its liberties. The core was always the health and security of the state, regardless of whether it was ruled by one or by many. Machiavelli's military philosophy extended far beyond technical discussions of tactics and battlefield strategy. He understood warfare as an integral part of a state's social and political fabric, not merely a separate professional pursuit. For him, the question of how a state organized its defense inevitably reflected its internal character, its virtues, and its capacity for self-preservation. This comprehensive view encompassed not just the clash of arms, but also the moral fiber of the citizens and their willingness to fight for their collective good. He argued that the art of war represented the most fundamental political skill because all other governmental endeavors depended upon it. Without the ability to defend its territory and its people, a state could not secure its laws, enforce justice, or foster economic prosperity. Military strength was the bedrock upon which all other political achievements rested. A government that failed in this primary duty was inherently fragile. This was a stark lesson drawn from his observations of Florentine weakness and the incessant conflicts across Italy. This insight generated a systematic analysis of military organization, with Machiavelli vehemently advocating for citizen soldiers over mercenaries. He observed that mercenary forces, motivated only by pay, lacked the necessary loyalty, discipline, and commitment to truly defend a state. Citizen armies, drawn from the populace, possessed a personal stake in their homeland and would fight with a patriotic fervor that mercenaries could never emulate. This distinction became a central pillar of his recommendations for both princes and republics. But his most profound contribution involved demonstrating how military preparation shapes domestic politics. A state that cultivated a strong citizen militia fostered civic virtues like discipline, courage, and collective responsibility among its people. Such a military not only protected the state from external threats, but also instilled a sense of shared purpose and identity, strengthening the social bonds within. Conversely, relying on foreign mercenaries weakened the moral fabric of society, making the populace complacent and vulnerable, ultimately undermining the very foundations of the state it purported to serve. This distinction, for Machiavelli, was not merely a matter of military efficiency, but a profound political and moral choice with far-reaching consequences for the state's internal character. He was not interested in the technical minutiae of battlefield formations or weapon specifications for their own sake. Instead, Machiavelli's military philosophy extends far beyond technical discussions of tactics and strategy to become a foundational element of his broader political theory. He argued that the art of war represents the most fundamental political skill, because all other governmental functions depend utterly on it. Without a secure state, free from the imminent threat of invasion or internal rebellion, no ruler can effectively administer justice, foster economic prosperity, or cultivate the arts and sciences. Peace and order, the prerequisites for any civilized society, are ultimately secured and maintained by military strength. A state unable to defend itself is, by definition, unable to govern itself, leaving its populace at the mercy of external powers or internal factions. Therefore, a leader's primary duty, indeed their very qualification for leadership, was to understand and master the principles of military organization and defense. This insight elevates military matters from a departmental concern to the central pillar of statecraft itself. This understanding naturally generates a systematic analysis of military organization, citizen soldiers versus mercenaries, and the inherent strengths and weaknesses of each. Machiavelli meticulously dissects the mechanisms through which different military structures influence the body politic. His arguments for a citizen militia, for instance, were not born from a romantic ideal alone, but from a pragmatic assessment of their superior reliability, loyalty, and cost-effectiveness compared to mercenaries, who he deemed a perpetual drain on state resources and a constant source of instability. Mercenaries, by their very nature, lacked any vested interest in the well-being of the state they served. Their loyalty was fleeting, contingent on payment, and easily bought by a higher bidder. Their existence encouraged dependency in the populace and arrogance in their commanders, often leading to either a state's defeat in battle or its subjugation by its supposed protectors. But his most profound contribution involves demonstrating how military preparation shapes domestic politics in ways that transcend immediate security concerns. The establishment of a citizen army, for instance, does more than just provide security. It fundamentally alters the relationship between the state and its citizens. By requiring service, it imbues citizens with a direct stake in the state's survival and success, fostering a sense of shared ownership and collective destiny. This active participation cultivates a robust civic identity, where individual good is inextricably linked to the common good. Furthermore, a well-organized citizen militia acts as a critical check on both internal corruption and potential tyranny. A ruler who depends on his own people for defense is less likely to oppress them, knowing that their loyalty and willingness to fight are paramount. Conversely, a ruler who relies on foreign arms becomes detached from his subjects, more prone to arbitrary rule, and ultimately more vulnerable to overthrow by the very forces he employs. The military structure, therefore, determines the very character of governance. A state that empowers its citizens through military service leans towards republican virtues of liberty and self-governance, while one that disarms its populace and relies on external forces often descends into despotism, with power concentrated in the hands of a few, maintained by force rather than consent. Machiavelli recognized that military policies have profound economic implications too. The upkeep of a mercenary force was a constant financial burden, diverting resources that could otherwise be invested in infrastructure, trade, or public welfare. A citizen army, while requiring training and equipment, leveraged the existing human capital of the state, often at a lower overall cost, and with the added benefit of fostering skills and discipline applicable to other areas of civic life. The act of military training, therefore, became a school for citizenship, teaching organization, cooperation, and respect for authority, virtues essential for a well-ordered society. His insights illuminate how the choices made regarding military organization ripple through every aspect of public life, influencing social cohesion, economic stability, and the fundamental balance of power within the state. For Machiavelli, military reform was never just about making armies more effective on the battlefield. It was about shaping the very soul of the republic or principality, determining its capacity for survival, its potential for greatness, and its susceptibility to decay. It was the master key to unlocking the true nature of political power and its exercise. This intricate web of interconnections reveals that the goal is not to choose between princely and republican approaches permanently, but to understand the inherent dynamics of each and to apply the appropriate principles given the specific circumstances and goals of the state. While Machiavelli clearly admired the civic virtues fostered by a republican militia, he was also a pragmatist. A newly established principality, facing immediate threats and lacking the ingrained civic traditions of an ancient republic, might require different initial approaches to military consolidation. The focus in such a case would be on establishing immediate security and centralizing authority, even if it meant a temporary reliance on methods that might not be ideal in the long run. The ultimate aim was always the preservation and prosperity of the state, and the means to achieve this could vary depending on whether one was founding, maintaining, or reforming a body politic. His analysis, therefore, is not a rigid prescription, but a dynamic framework for political action. It encourages leaders to assess their unique historical context, the nature of their populace, and the specific threats they face when making military decisions. A prince might need to forge a strong, personal army to secure his rule in turbulent times, while a republic would thrive by nurturing a robust citizen militia. The wisdom lies in understanding why certain military structures yield particular political outcomes, and then applying that knowledge judiciously. A leader, whether prince or republican magistrate, must be adept at adapting their military strategy to the political realities, always keeping in mind the long-term impact on the state's internal health and external standing. Machiavelli's exploration of military matters is thus less a manual for soldiers and more a foundational text for statesmen. It argues that a strong military is not merely an instrument of foreign policy, but the very sinews of the state, defining its character, shaping its institutions, and ultimately determining its fate. The strength of arms and the wisdom of governance are two sides of the same coin, inseparable and mutually reinforcing. To neglect one is to imperil the other, and ultimately to jeopardize the very existence of the political community. This comprehensive view compels leaders to treat military readiness not as an optional luxury, but as a continuous, vital aspect of their highest calling. After this period of democratic flourishing, a curious paradox began to emerge, a subtle erosion from within. The very triumphs of democratic governance slowly started to undermine the foundational social conditions upon which its effectiveness rested. As the system proved its capacity to deliver peace and prosperity, the urgent need for active citizen participation, the vigilant engagement in public life, seemed to recede. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, but one that would prove deeply consequential for the future of the state. This growing prosperity, a hallmark of successful democracies, inadvertently cultivated a citizenry increasingly preoccupied with private concerns. Individuals became more focused on accumulating personal wealth, pursuing leisure, and securing their own comfort, rather than investing their precious time and energy in the demanding, often thankless work of civic engagement. The public square, once a vibrant arena for debate and collective action, saw a decline in sustained attention. Without a robust and dedicated body of citizens willing to debate, compromise, and hold leaders accountable, the democratic machinery began to lose its vital lubrication, making it vulnerable to new pressures. Into this vacuum, the allure of political success began to attract a new kind of leader, the demagogue. These individuals, often charismatic and skilled in rhetoric, were adept at exploiting democratic procedures to gain power, yet they often lacked genuine statesmanship, a deep commitment to the common good, or the necessary wisdom to govern justly. They appealed to emotions, prejudices, and short-term desires, rather than to reason or long-term societal benefit. This historical pattern, observed across many eras and cultures, highlights the danger when the mechanisms designed for popular rule are commandeered by those who seek only personal or factional ascendancy. Meanwhile, another powerful force was at work beneath the surface, growing economic inequality. As some prospered greatly, others struggled, creating widening gaps between social strata. This disparity naturally led to factional conflicts, where different groups with divergent economic interests found themselves increasingly at odds. The democratic institutions, designed to balance competing interests and forge consensus, often found themselves unable to resolve these deep-seated material conflicts. The very framework of government struggled to mediate when the underlying economic divides became too vast to bridge through conventional political means. The culmination of these internal pressures, civic apathy, the rise of demagogues, and unresolvable factional strife, often led to a tragic degeneration of democracy. It could descend into mob rule, a chaotic state where passion overrode principle and decisions were swayed by the loudest voices rather than careful deliberation, or into a destructive factional chaos, where warring groups paralyzed the state. In such an environment, where order gave way to instability and the collective good seemed lost, citizens inevitably became weary of the constant turmoil and the pervasive sense of insecurity. This exhaustion, this longing for stability, created fertile ground for a different kind of rule to emerge. This exhaustion, this longing for stability, created fertile ground for a different kind of rule to emerge. The very triumph of democracy, ironically, often contained the seeds of its own decline. Initial democratic success, marked by the establishment of stable institutions and the promise of liberty, frequently ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity. Freed from the immediate struggles for survival or the shackles of oppression, citizens began to enjoy a higher quality of life, greater personal freedoms, and an abundance of opportunities previously unimaginable. However, this newfound prosperity, while a testament to democratic efficacy, gradually undermined the very social conditions necessary for effective democratic functioning. As life became more comfortable, individuals increasingly focused on their private concerns, their careers, their families, their personal leisure, and the accumulation of wealth. The urgency to participate actively in public life, to dedicate time and energy to civic duties, or to engage in the often tedious and challenging work of self-governance, began to wane. The once vibrant public sphere, where citizens debated, organized, and held their representatives accountable, slowly became depopulated, replaced by a growing apathy. Voting turnout might remain high in some areas, but the deeper, more consistent civic engagement, the critical thinking, the informed deliberation, the willingness to compromise for the collective good suffered. Politics transformed from a shared responsibility into a distant spectacle, a profession for others to manage, leaving the majority disinclined to invest the mental and emotional resources required to sustain a healthy democracy. This erosion of civic vigilance, coupled with the apparent stability brought by democratic institutions, created an opportunistic vacuum. Into this space, political success, initially measured by peace and prosperity, began to attract a different breed of ambitious individuals, demagogues. These figures, often charismatic and adept at public speaking, possessed little genuine commitment to democratic principles or the long-term well-being of the state. Instead, they were driven by a singular desire for power, and they expertly exploited the very democratic procedures designed to empower citizens. They thrived on the reduced critical thinking of a disengaged populace, using simplified slogans, emotional appeals, and scapegoating to rally support. They promised easy solutions to complex problems, flattered the common person, and stoked grievances, often against perceived elites or minority groups. Their success lay in their ability to bypass reasoned debate, appealing directly to the passions and prejudices of the crowd, rather than engaging in thoughtful deliberation with their peers. They presented themselves as the authentic voice of the people, even as they chipped away at the foundations of representative government and individual rights. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of this apparent tranquility, economic inequality, an insidious byproduct of unfettered market forces and uneven distribution of prosperity, began to deepen. While some thrived in the new democratic economy, others found themselves marginalized, left behind by technological advancements or global competition. This growing disparity in wealth and opportunity naturally bred resentment and social division. As the gap between the rich and the poor widened, society fractured into competing factions, each convinced of its own righteousness and often unwilling to recognize the legitimate concerns of others. Labor pitted against capital, urban against rural, various identity groups against each other. These conflicts became increasingly intractable. The democratic institutions, designed for compromise and consensus building, found themselves ill-equipped to resolve these deeply entrenched factional conflicts. When the rich could use their influence to sway policy, and the poor felt unheard and unrepresented, the very legitimacy of the democratic process came into question. The mechanisms for fair representation and negotiation, which relied on a degree of shared purpose and mutual respect, buckled under the weight of irreconcilable interests. The cumulative effect of these trends was the degeneration of democracy from its ideal form into something resembling either mob rule or pervasive factional chaos. In the former, the demagogue, having successfully harnessed popular sentiment, could override legal and constitutional constraints, transforming public opinion into an arbitrary decree, often with little regard for minority rights or due process. In the latter, the state became paralyzed by warring groups, each blocking the other, preventing any meaningful governance or collective action. Public policy became a battleground for narrow interests, rather than a pursuit of the common good. Projects stalled, crises went unaddressed, and the basic functions of government deteriorated. In such an environment, where order gave way to instability and the collective good seemed lost, citizens inevitably became weary of the constant turmoil and the pervasive sense of insecurity. The promise of freedom had devolved into a cacophony of competing voices and a paralysis of action. The very liberty they once cherished now felt like a burden, an endless source of conflict and anxiety. This exhaustion, this longing for stability, created fertile ground for a different kind of rule to emerge, a rule that promised order, unity, and decisive action, often at the cost of the very freedoms that had, ironically, led to democracy's initial success and subsequent decline. The memory of the vibrant, self-governing republic faded, replaced by a yearning for an authority strong enough to impose calm, even if it meant sacrificing the messy, demanding work of freedom. They sought a firm hand, believing that any peace, even one enforced by decree, was preferable to the endless, debilitating strife of a democracy that had lost its way. The stage was set for the ascendancy of a leader or an ideology that offered a seemingly simple solution: an end to the chaos, a restoration of order, and a singular vision for the state, often by dismantling the very democratic frameworks that had allowed such instability to flourish. We have previously explored Niccolo Machiavelli's profound observations on the acquisition and retention of political power, often through means that disregarded conventional morality. His insights, however, remain distinctive not solely for their frankness, but crucially because they focus on the practical requirements for maintaining a stable and effective state. This goes beyond mere military strength or cunning diplomacy, extending into the often overlooked, yet fundamental economic dimensions that underpin all political authority. He understood that a prince or government could not long endure without a reliable and sustainable financial base to fund its operations and secure its position. Understanding these economic dimensions of political power remains crucial for anyone seeking to build or sustain a lasting political entity, from a city-state to a vast empire. Machiavelli recognized that resources were not infinite, and that their allocation and acquisition inherently involved trade-offs and risks. A ruler might conquer new lands, but without the economic capacity to administer them and maintain order, that conquest would prove fleeting. This pragmatic view cut through idealistic notions of governance, revealing the sinews of economic reality that bind political ambition to concrete possibility. Modern democracies, despite their vastly different structures and values compared to Renaissance Florence, continue to struggle with many of the same economic challenges that Machiavelli identified centuries ago. Issues such as public debt, the equitable distribution of tax burdens, the cost of defense, and the funding of public services are perennial concerns that governments grapple with globally. The pressure to provide for the populace while also securing state interests, often with limited resources, echoes the dilemmas faced by princes and republics in his time. The foundation of Machiavellian economic analysis rests on his observation that governments require consistent and adequate revenue streams to fulfill their core functions. Without these funds, a state cannot raise armies, pay officials, construct infrastructure, or provide basic security and justice for its citizens. These are not luxuries, they are the bedrock upon which any organized society stands. For Machiavelli, a ruler who could not manage the state's finances was as vulnerable as one who neglected its military defenses, because both deficiencies directly imperiled the state's very existence. But every method of raising revenue creates political costs that can undermine governmental legitimacy and stability. Taxation, for instance, provides necessary funds, but can provoke resentment and rebellion if perceived as unjust or excessive. Confiscation of property might fill the coffers temporarily, but erodes trust and incentivizes flight or opposition among the populace and powerful families. Printing more money could lead to inflation, harming the common people and the state's long-term economic health. Machiavelli saw these as inherent dilemmas, forcing rulers to choose between necessary funding and potential popular disfavor, a delicate balance that few mastered without significant political consequence. But his insights remain distinctive because they focus on the practical requirements for maintaining a state's power, stability, and independence, rather than on abstract moral or ideal systems of governance. Machiavelli wasn't just observing the mechanics of revenue. He was analyzing how financial health directly influenced a ruler's ability to wage war, secure alliances, administer justice, and ultimately survive. For him, a prince's ability to manage the state's finances was as critical as his military prowess or diplomatic skill. A rich state could deter aggression, fund necessary reforms, and even buy loyalty when traditional bonds failed. Conversely, a poor state was vulnerable, prone to internal strife, and easily subjugated by more powerful neighbors. This pragmatic, hard-nosed approach to economic realities set his work apart, making it a timeless manual for power rather than a utopian blueprint. Understanding these economic dimensions of political power remains crucial for anyone seeking to build or sustain effective governance today. Machiavelli's observations highlight the often overlooked truth that grand political visions and moral ideals, however noble, can crumble if not underpinned by a sound economic foundation. Whether it's a nascent political movement striving for influence or an established nation grappling with global challenges, the ability to manage resources, generate wealth, and distribute its benefits, or burdens, strategically is paramount. Economic strength translates directly into political leverage, both domestically and on the international stage, influencing a state's capacity for innovation, defense, and social cohesion. The foundation of Machiavellian economic analysis rests on his observation that governments require consistent and substantial funding to perform their essential functions. In his time, this meant paying mercenary armies, maintaining fortifications, funding diplomatic missions, supporting a burgeoning state bureaucracy, and occasionally undertaking public works to gain popular favor. Without a reliable income stream, a prince would be constantly at the mercy of others reliant on loans from wealthy citizens or foreign powers, which invariably came with strings attached, or forced to resort to desperate measures that alienated the populace. He understood that a state's solvency was not merely an accounting matter, but a cornerstone of its sovereignty, and a prerequisite for any meaningful exercise of power. But every method of raising revenue creates political costs that can undermine governmental legitimacy, a dilemma Machiavelli explored with characteristic realism. While confiscation of wealth from a few powerful individuals might seem efficient, it breeds fear and resentment among the elite, potentially inciting rebellion. Heavy taxation on the common people, though widespread, could lead to popular unrest and a loss of faith in the ruler. Printing more money, as noted, leads to inflation, punishing everyone and destabilizing the economy. Machiavelli recognized that a ruler's challenge was not just how to raise funds, but how to do so in a manner that minimized political fallout and preserved the state's long-term health and the ruler's authority. He implicitly advocated for a balance, a judicious mix of revenue streams, and an understanding of the psychological impact of different fiscal policies on various segments of society. The ideal was to extract resources with the least possible resentment and with the greatest possible perceived justification, even if that justification was simply the necessity of maintaining order and defending the realm. Modern democracies continue to struggle with many of the same economic challenges that Machiavelli identified, albeit within different political frameworks. The fundamental tension between the state's need for resources and the public's desire to retain their wealth remains a central axis of political debate. Debates over national debt, for instance, mirror Machiavelli's concerns about the dangers of a state becoming indebted to external powers or its own citizens, potentially losing its freedom of action. Governments today, like princes of old, must fund vast military machines, extensive public services, social welfare programs, and infrastructure projects. The methods of doing so, income taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes, tariffs, borrowing, all carry distinct political costs. Consider the perennial struggle over tax policy in contemporary nations. High income tax rates might be lauded by some as a means of wealth redistribution and funding social programs, but they are often decried by others as disincentives to economic growth and an infringement on individual liberty. Similarly, consumption taxes, like VAT or sales tax, might be efficient to collect, but they often disproportionately affect lower-income households, leading to accusations of unfairness and potentially sparking popular discontent. Debates around government spending often highlight the Machiavellian dilemma. Should scarce resources be allocated to defense, ensuring national security but diverting funds from social services? Or should they prioritize health care and education, potentially at the cost of military readiness? Each choice carries a clear economic consequence and an even clearer political one, shaping public opinion, electoral outcomes, and the perceived legitimacy of the governing party. The temptation to print more money, though often couched in modern terms like quantitative easing, still carries the Machiavellian warning of inflation and economic instability, demonstrating that the underlying principles remain constant even as the economic tools evolve. Populist movements frequently capitalize on public frustration with economic inequality or perceived governmental waste, leveraging Machiavelli's observation that financial strain can quickly erode trust and incite opposition. Whether it's the funding of universal healthcare, climate change initiatives, or large-scale infrastructure projects. Modern governments are constantly performing a delicate balancing act, attempting to secure the necessary funds without alienating key constituencies, stifling economic activity, or jeopardizing their own political survival. The enduring relevance of Machiavelli's economic insights lies precisely in this timeless recognition. Economics and politics are not separate spheres but inextricably linked, each profoundly influencing the other in the grand, often ruthless, game of power. After navigating the turbulent waters of singular leadership models, we observe how many societies sought a different path, one that blended elements from seemingly opposing systems. These mixed structures, combining hereditary and elective elements, represented a pragmatic attempt to harness the distinct advantages of each. A society might, for instance, retain a monarch or a ruling house to provide a clear line of succession and symbolic continuity, while simultaneously establishing an elected parliament or council to ensure popular representation and fresh perspectives on governance. This hybrid approach aimed to mitigate the inherent instability of purely elective systems, which could suffer from frequent power struggles, and also to counteract the potential for tyranny or stagnation often seen in absolute hereditary rule. The goal was to build a state both stable in its foundations and responsive to its people. Within such systems, and indeed within any enduring state, the role of institutional memory and bureaucratic continuity becomes paramount in maintaining governmental effectiveness. Beyond the changing faces of kings, queens, presidents, or prime ministers lies the steady hum of a permanent administrative apparatus. This apparatus comprises career civil servants, meticulously maintained records, and established protocols that transcend individual tenures. These elements form a collective memory, preserving knowledge of past decisions, precedents, and the intricate workings of the state. It is this unseen but vital backbone that ensures the machinery of government continues to function, day in and day out, regardless of who occupies the highest offices. Central to this continuity are professional bureaucracies, bodies designed to operate according to established procedures and technical expertise. These are staffed by individuals selected for their skills and qualifications, rather than their political affiliations or social standing. From tax collectors and public health officials, to engineers maintaining infrastructure and educators shaping future generations, these professionals are expected to apply rules impartially and execute policies efficiently. Their work is characterized by a commitment to objective standards, a division of labor, and a hierarchical structure that allows for systematic decision-making and accountability, creating a predictable framework for public administration. This administrative continuity serves a critical function by preventing succession crises or dramatic political shifts from completely disrupting essential governmental services. When a ruler dies or an election results in a new governing party, the everyday operations of the state do not grind to a halt. Hospitals continue to treat patients, roads remain patrolled, utilities deliver power and water, and the mail continues to be delivered. This resilience is not accidental. It is a deliberate design feature of stable states. The professional bureaucracy acts as a shock absorber, insulating the public from the full impact of political upheaval, thereby maintaining public trust and the fundamental order upon which society depends. Yet this very strength also harbors a significant potential weakness. Bureaucratic institutions, by their nature, can resist necessary changes and may develop interests that conflict with the broader public good or the intentions of elected leaders. Their adherence to established procedures, while often beneficial, can calcify into inflexibility, making it difficult to adapt to new challenges or implement innovative policies. Furthermore, a powerful bureaucracy can become a self-serving entity, prioritizing its own survival, expansion, or internal rules over the needs of the citizens it is meant to serve. This can lead to slow decision-making, excessive red tape, and a disconnect between the administrative state and the evolving will of the people it governs, presenting a persistent challenge to even the most carefully constructed mixed systems. The challenge, therefore, lies not merely in establishing such an administrative apparatus, but in perpetually refining the mechanisms of accountability and oversight that prevent it from becoming a state within a state. While the initial rationale for a professional bureaucracy within a mixed system is overwhelmingly positive, to provide the continuity and expertise that might otherwise be lacking, its potential for entrenchment is a constant counterweight. Indeed, the very qualities that make a professional bureaucracy invaluable, its adherence to established procedures and reliance on technical expertise, key point 3, can morph into rigid dogma when faced with the need for systemic reform. Bureaucrats, having dedicated careers to mastering complex regulations and operational protocols, often view deviations from these norms with suspicion, seeing them as threats to efficiency or stability. This inherent conservatism, while beneficial for maintaining consistent public services, can become an impediment to the agile response required by rapidly changing societal needs or the democratic mandate expressed through elective processes. For instance, a long-established government department might resist the integration of new technologies or the streamlining of application processes, not out of malice, but from a deeply ingrained belief in the efficacy of existing methods and a natural human aversion to disrupting familiar routines. Such resistance can lead to policy gridlock, where the political will of elected representatives or the guiding vision of a hereditary head of state founders against the immovable object of administrative inertia. Furthermore, over time, bureaucratic institutions may develop their own distinct interests that subtly or overtly conflict with the broader public good, key point 5. This can manifest in several ways. A department might prioritize the expansion of its own budget or personnel, regardless of actual need, simply to enhance its internal power and prestige. Agencies might engage in turf wars with other departments, hoarding information or resisting inter-agency cooperation to protect their perceived domain. Internal rules and hierarchical structures, initially designed to ensure fairness and efficiency, can become ends in themselves, creating excessive red tape that hinders service delivery and frustrates citizens. The pursuit of job security, comfortable working conditions, or even post-retirement benefits for public servants can, in extreme cases, overshadow the primary mission of serving the populace. When these internal interests become paramount, the bureaucracy transitions from being a neutral implementer of policy to an active, often powerful, participant in the political process, capable of lobbying for its own benefits and resisting external control. This dynamic presents a significant democratic deficit within any system, but especially in a mixed one that aims to balance diverse forms of representation and governance. The inherent value of institutional memory and bureaucratic continuity in maintaining governmental effectiveness, key point 2, cannot be overstated. In systems combining hereditary and elective elements, key point 1, where leadership transitions can occur due to a monarch's death or an election's outcome, the professional bureaucracy acts as a crucial ballast. This administrative continuity prevents succession crises from disrupting essential governmental services, key point 4. Whether it's the consistent operation of public health initiatives, the ongoing maintenance of critical infrastructure like roads and power grids, the continuity of national defense operations, or the impartial administration of justice, these vital functions depend on a stable, non-partisan workforce. Without the deep institutional knowledge residing within the civil service knowledge of complex legal frameworks, historical precedents, technical specifications, and inter-agency relationships, each change in political leadership could plunge the state into chaos. New leaders, regardless of their vision or legitimacy, rely heavily on the accumulated wisdom and operational capacity of the bureaucracy to translate their mandates into actionable policy and ensure the day-to-day functioning of the state. However, the very continuity that provides stability can also breed complacency or an imperviousness to external critique. The long-term tenures often characteristic of civil service careers can foster an us versus Them mentality, where the permanent administration views transient politicians or even the general public as ill-informed or naive regarding the complexities of governance. This can lead to a subtle undermining of policy directives, where implementation is deliberately slowed, distorted, or reinterpreted to align with the bureaucracy's preferred outcome rather than the stated intent of the political leadership. Such actions, even if not overtly defiant, erode the democratic principle of accountability and can paralyze governance. The challenge for a mixed system, then, becomes one of striking a delicate balance, nurturing and valuing the institutional memory and technical prowess of its bureaucracy, while simultaneously ensuring that it remains responsive to the evolving will of the people and the strategic direction set by its elected and hereditary leadership. Effective governance in a mixed system thus demands a perpetual effort to integrate bureaucratic efficiency with democratic accountability. Mechanisms such as independent oversight bodies, parliamentary committees with subpoena power, robust freedom of information laws, and transparent reporting requirements are essential to shine a light on administrative processes and decision-making. Merit-based recruitment and promotion, along with continuous professional development, help to maintain the quality and impartiality of the civil service. Crucially, leadership from both the hereditary and elective spheres must actively engage with the bureaucracy, not just to issue directives, but to foster a culture of service, innovation, and adaptability. This involves articulating clear policy objectives, demanding measurable outcomes, and holding agencies accountable for their performance, rather than simply accepting administrative inertia as an unavoidable cost of stability. Moreover, the design of a mixed system itself can offer unique avenues for addressing bureaucratic overreach. A hereditary head of state, for instance, often stands outside the partisan fray and can act as a unifying figure or an arbiter in disputes between different branches of government or conflicting bureaucratic interests. Their long-term perspective, divorced from electoral cycles, can sometimes provide the necessary impetus to tackle deeply entrenched bureaucratic issues that short-term political leaders might avoid. Conversely, the elective components, through their direct connection to the populace, provide a vital feedback loop. Citizen complaints about bureaucratic inefficiency or unresponsiveness, channeled through elected representatives, can serve as powerful drivers for reform, pressuring administrative bodies to adapt and improve their service delivery. The very multiplicity of power centers in a mixed system legislative, executive, potentially an independent judiciary, and the unique position of a hereditary head means that there are numerous points of leverage to challenge and reform a bureaucracy that has strayed from its intended purpose. However, each of these control mechanisms carries its own risks. Excessive political interference in bureaucratic operations, for example, can undermine the very professionalism and impartiality that make the civil service valuable, leading to politicization and patronage. Conversely, an overly powerful hereditary head of state, unchecked by other branches, could use the bureaucracy to consolidate personal power, bypassing democratic processes. The ideal is a dynamic equilibrium where the bureaucracy enjoys sufficient autonomy to perform its technical functions efficiently and impartially, yet remains ultimately subordinate to the legitimate authority of the state, as expressed through its combined hereditary and elective elements. This constant negotiation between bureaucratic stability and political responsiveness highlights a fundamental tension at the heart of modern governance, a tension perhaps amplified in mixed systems seeking to harness the best of seemingly disparate traditions. The goal is not to eliminate bureaucracy, which is indispensable for the functioning of any large modern state, but to cultivate a form of public administration that is both effective and accountable, adaptable yet stable, and truly serves the citizens it is meant to protect and empower. The success of a mixed system in the long run will depend heavily on its ability to manage this inherent contradiction, ensuring that the administrative state remains a servant of the people, rather than becoming its master. The ongoing discourse and institutional design Efforts dedicated to achieving this balance remain a defining feature of political evolution in such complex systems. To create effective legal systems, societies must craft enforcement strategies that function within their existing political and social realities. Rules written on paper, however perfectly conceived, are inert without mechanisms to ensure their observance. This means legal systems cannot operate in a vacuum, detached from the customs, power structures, and beliefs that define a community. They must instead engage with the messy, complex landscape of human behavior, understanding that pure ideal enforcement is rarely achievable. This pragmatic approach recognizes that the legitimacy of a legal system is not solely derived from its fairness or justice in abstract terms, but crucially from its capacity to be practically applied and respected by the people it governs. We can see this as an application of legal realism, an idea suggesting that the law is not merely what is written in statutes, but what judges, police, and ordinary citizens actually do with those words. This practical imperative often leads to selective enforcement, where the focus shifts to the most critical legal requirements. Governments with limited resources, or those facing significant resistance to change, cannot pursue every infraction with equal vigor. Instead, they might prioritize certain offenses, implement new laws gradually, or design regulations that are inherently easier to monitor and enforce given the local conditions. For instance, a new environmental law might initially target large industrial polluters rather than individual households, because their impact is greater and their activities easier to track. This strategic compliance is not a failure of the legal ideal, but a necessary adaptation to reality. It acknowledges that achieving perfect adherence to every rule may be less effective than focusing on key areas that produce the greatest benefit for the society as a whole. In modern contexts, we observe several innovative approaches to legal enforcement that reflect this understanding. Community policing programs, for example, move away from purely punitive models, seeking to build trust and cooperation between law enforcement and citizens. Regulatory bodies increasingly emphasize negotiation, incentives, and collaborative problem solving over strict punishment, encouraging businesses to voluntarily comply with standards. Restorative justice models, which focus on repairing harm rather than simply punishing offenders, also exemplify this shift. These approaches recognize that fostering a sense of shared responsibility and legitimacy among the populace can often be more potent than relying solely on the threat of sanctions. They aim to integrate legal enforcement into the social fabric, making it a cooperative endeavor rather than an adversarial one. Understanding these enforcement dynamics is crucial for explaining why formal legal reforms often produce disappointing or unintended results. Simply transplanting a successful legal framework from one culture to another, or imposing new laws without considering the existing social and political context, frequently leads to failure. A perfectly drafted anti-corruption law, for instance, may have little impact if the political institutions are themselves riddled with patronage networks, or if the public lacks faith in the judicial system. This phenomenon highlights that law is not just a set of rules, but a living system deeply interwoven with a society's values, power relationships, and capacity for collective action. Without addressing these underlying factors, even the most well-intentioned legal changes remain mere declarations, unable to translate into real-world behavior change or achieve their desired impact. Effective legal systems must therefore develop enforcement strategies that work within existing political and social realities, rather than assuming a blank slate or an ideal societal structure. This pragmatic approach acknowledges that laws do not operate in a vacuum. Their implementation is filtered through the lens of local customs, power structures, economic constraints, and prevailing public sentiment. Ignoring these deeply embedded factors leads to laws that exist merely on paper. Detached from the lived experiences of the populace they are intended to govern. A truly effective system must be adaptive, understanding that the goal is not just perfect compliance with every letter of the law, but rather the achievement of its underlying policy objectives in the most feasible and sustainable way possible. This often involves a delicate balance between strict adherence and flexible application, tailored to the specific context. This might involve selective enforcement that focuses on the most important legal requirements, understanding that resources are finite, and that attempting to enforce every minor infraction equally can dilute the impact of enforcement on more significant issues. Prioritizing allows authorities to direct their limited capacity towards behaviors that cause the greatest harm or undermine societal stability most acutely. For instance, in developing economies, regulators might initially concentrate on ensuring basic safety standards in industries rather than immediately enforcing every advanced environmental regulation, gradually increasing the scope as capacity and public awareness grow. This strategic prioritization is not an abandonment of the law, but a recognition of practical limitations, aiming for incremental progress that builds trust and compliance over time. It requires a clear understanding of the law's ultimate goals and a willingness to make difficult choices about what truly matters most for the well-being of the community. Furthermore, effective enforcement can utilize graduated sanctions, where penalties escalate in severity based on the nature of the violation, the offender's intent, and their history of compliance. This approach contrasts with one-size-fits-all punitive measures, offering a spectrum of responses from warnings and educational interventions for minor or first-time offenses, to increasingly stringent fines, temporary suspensions, or ultimately criminal prosecution for egregious or repeated violations. Graduated sanctions provide flexibility, allowing enforcement bodies to address non-compliance proportionately, fostering a sense of fairness and encouraging voluntary correction rather than immediate, often alienating, punishment. When individuals or organizations understand that minor missteps will be met with opportunities to course-correct before harsher penalties are imposed, they are often more willing to engage with regulatory bodies and proactively address issues. This system not only saves judicial resources, but also cultivates a more cooperative relationship between the state and its citizens, promoting a culture of compliance through incentives for good behavior and escalating disincentives for persistent misconduct. Leveraging informal social controls is another critical, often overlooked dimension of enforcement. Formal legal systems operate most efficiently when they are complemented and reinforced by community norms, peer pressure, and the desire for social acceptance. In many societies, the fear of community ostracization or reputational damage can be a more potent deterrent than a formal legal penalty. Integrating informal controls means designing laws and enforcement mechanisms that resonate with and ideally reinforce existing community values and structures. This could involve empowering local leaders, community groups, or traditional dispute resolution mechanisms to play a role in resolving minor infractions or mediating conflicts before they escalate to the formal judicial system. When laws align with deeply held community values, compliance becomes more of a natural outgrowth of social cohesion rather than solely an imposed obligation. This approach also enhances the legitimacy of the legal system, as it is seen as reflecting and upholding shared societal principles rather than being an external, alien force. Ignoring these informal mechanisms risks creating a disconnect, where formal law is perceived as an imposition rather than a tool for collective well-being. Modern examples of these adaptive enforcement strategies abound. Community policing programs, for instance, exemplify the integration of formal law enforcement with local social realities. Instead of solely reacting to crime, community policing emphasizes building relationships between police officers and residents, fostering trust, and jointly identifying and addressing underlying causes of crime and disorder. Officers become familiar with neighborhood dynamics, key community figures, and local concerns, allowing for more nuanced and effective responses than a purely enforcement-focused model. This approach often involves problem-oriented policing, where specific issues, e.g., persistent graffiti, petty theft in a particular area, are analyzed and tailored solutions, often involving community participation and non-punitive interventions, are developed. By establishing a visible and approachable presence, police can leverage informal social controls, encourage reporting, and build a sense of collective responsibility for public safety, thereby reducing reliance on punitive measures alone. This shift from an adversarial relationship to a collaborative one significantly enhances the legitimacy of law enforcement and its effectiveness in maintaining order. Similarly, regulatory approaches that emphasize cooperation and education over punishment are gaining traction, particularly in fields like environmental protection, public health, and workplace safety. These models often begin with compliance assistance, providing regulated entities with information, guidance, and resources to understand and meet legal requirements. Inspectors might offer advice on best practices, conduct training sessions, or help develop compliance plans. Penalties are often reserved for those who intentionally violate regulations, repeatedly fail to comply after receiving assistance, or cause significant harm. This smart regulation paradigm recognizes that most regulated entities want to comply, but may lack the knowledge, resources, or capacity to do so fully. By investing in education and support, regulators can achieve higher rates of voluntary compliance, fostering a proactive approach to risk management rather than a reactive one driven by fear of penalties. This cooperative model not only improves compliance, but also builds a more collaborative and trusting relationship between regulators and the regulated community, ultimately leading to better outcomes for public welfare. Restorative justice initiatives further illustrate the power of integrating informal mechanisms and focusing on broader social outcomes. Unlike traditional retributive justice, which primarily focuses on punishing the offender, restorative justice seeks to repair the harm caused by crime by involving victims, offenders, and the community in a mediated process. This can include victim-offender mediation, family group conferencing, or community sentencing circles. The goals are to address the needs of the victim, e.g., restitution, understanding, apology, encourage offenders to take responsibility for their actions and make amends, and strengthen community bonds. While still operating within a legal framework, restorative justice leverages social pressure, empathy, and collective responsibility to achieve rehabilitation and reconciliation, often with more satisfying outcomes for all parties than traditional incarceration. It demonstrates how legal systems can move beyond mere punishment to actively foster healing and reintegration, drawing on the community's capacity for collective action and moral suasion. Understanding these enforcement dynamics helps explain why formal legal reform often produces disappointing results, if not accompanied by a robust understanding of local context and implementation challenges. A meticulously drafted law, inspired by best practices from another jurisdiction, can fail spectacularly if it clashes with deeply entrenched customs, faces resistance from powerful vested interests, or if the institutions charged with its enforcement lack the capacity, resources, or political will to implement it effectively. The mere act of passing a law does not guarantee its impact. Its true power lies in its translation into consistent, fair, and legitimate enforcement on the ground. This requires careful consideration of the socio-political landscape, the economic conditions, and the cultural norms that will shape its reception and application. Reforms that overlook these realities often end up being paper laws, impressive in text but impotent in practice, leading to disillusionment and erosion of public trust in the legal system itself. Therefore, successful legal reform is not merely a legislative exercise, but a complex process of institutional development, capacity building, and social engineering. It necessitates investing in training for police, judges, and administrative officials, ensuring adequate budgetary allocations for enforcement agencies, fostering transparency and accountability to combat corruption, and launching public awareness campaigns to educate citizens about their rights and responsibilities under new laws. Moreover, it demands a willingness to experiment, learn from failures, and adapt strategies in response to real-world feedback. Reforms must be incremental and iterative, allowing for adjustments as their impact is observed and understood. The most effective legal systems are those that are dynamic, continuously evolving to meet new challenges while remaining deeply rooted in the specific societal context they serve, constantly striving to bridge the gap between abstract legal principles and tangible, positive societal change. This involves building a legal culture that values adherence, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a shared understanding of the law's role in promoting justice, order, and collective well-being. The journey from a declaration of law to its effective implementation is long and arduous, requiring sustained political commitment, public engagement, and institutional resilience. It is a testament to the idea that law is not an external imposition, but rather an organic extension of a society's ongoing effort to organize itself, resolve disputes, and achieve common goals. The most enduring legal frameworks are those that are perceived as legitimate, reflecting the collective will and values of the people they govern, thereby fostering voluntary compliance and ensuring their long-term viability and impact. After considering these intricate dynamics, we arrive at a crucial understanding. The effectiveness of institutional arrangements is never a standalone achievement. Instead, the optimal ways in which societies choose to govern themselves and to constrain potential abuses of power fundamentally depend on a broader tapestry of social conditions, technological capabilities, and deeply ingrained cultural norms. A system designed for one context may utterly fail in another, highlighting that there is no universal blueprint for perfect governance. Adaptability and local relevance are paramount. For instance, a nation with high social trust and strong community bonds might find certain informal accountability mechanisms highly effective, whereas a society grappling with deep divisions may require more rigid, legally defined checks and balances. The speed and reach of information technology also play a decisive role. Digital tools for public record keeping or citizen reporting were unimaginable a few generations ago, yet they are now critical enablers for modern governance. Furthermore, a culture that values civic engagement and individual rights will naturally interact with institutions differently than one that prioritizes collective harmony or deference to authority, directly influencing how transparent policies are received and utilized. One widely championed approach to constrain corruption involves the implementation of transparency mechanisms, specifically those that provide public access to governmental information. The underlying principle is simple. Shining a light on government operations makes it significantly harder for officials to engage in illicit activities undetected. By making budgets, contracts, policy decisions, and even the personal financial disclosures of public servants openly available, these mechanisms empower citizens and oversight bodies to scrutinize actions that would otherwise remain hidden. This public accessibility fosters a sense of accountability, creating a disincentive for corruption by increasing the risk of exposure and subsequent punishment. However, the mere existence of such transparency tools, while necessary, is often not sufficient to curb corruption effectively. A critical limitation arises when civil society lacks the intrinsic capacity to monitor governmental activities, demand accountability, or act decisively on information that is revealed. Imagine a scenario where mountains of data are made publicly available, but citizens lack the education, the time, the organizational structures, or even the basic internet access to sift through it, interpret it, and then translate that understanding into meaningful civic action. Without robust investigative journalism, active citizen groups, or effective legal avenues for redress, even the most comprehensive transparency portals can become little more than symbolic gestures, failing to translate into genuine governmental honesty. Similarly, competitive elections are frequently heralded as a vital mechanism for providing incentives for honest government. allowing voters to remove corrupt officials and reward those who uphold public trust. The electoral process theoretically creates a strong motivation for politicians to maintain a clean public image and to deliver on promises of good governance, lest they face the wrath of the ballot box. When citizens have a genuine choice between candidates, and when those choices are based on transparent records and policy proposals, elections can indeed serve as a powerful deterrent against corruption, fostering a dynamic where public service is incentivized by the desire for re-election. Yet electoral competition itself can inadvertently create perverse incentives that lead to campaign finance violations and other forms of illicit behavior. The intense pressure to win elections, often requiring substantial financial resources, can push candidates and parties towards questionable fundraising practices. This can include soliciting illegal donations, engaging in quid pro quo exchanges with wealthy benefactors, or even misappropriating public funds for campaign purposes. The pursuit of victory, when it becomes the sole driving force, can erode ethical boundaries, transforming the very mechanism designed to ensure honesty into a breeding ground for new forms of corruption, as the cost of entry and the stakes of losing become too high to ignore. The pursuit of victory, when it becomes the sole driving force, can erode ethical boundaries, transforming the very mechanism designed to ensure honesty into a breeding ground for new forms of corruption, as the cost of entry and the stakes of losing become too high to ignore. However, it is crucial not to overlook the fundamental positive role that competitive elections are designed to play. Competitive elections, at their core, provide powerful incentives for honest government by allowing voters to remove corrupt officials. The specter of electoral defeat can serve as a potent deterrent, motivating incumbents to maintain a reasonable degree of probity and responsiveness to their constituents' needs. When citizens possess the genuine power to vote out a government perceived as corrupt, inefficient, or unresponsive, this creates a vital feedback loop. It encourages officials to think twice before engaging in illicit activities, as their actions will ultimately be judged at the ballot box. This democratic accountability is a cornerstone of good governance, offering a regular, peaceful mechanism for societal course correction and holding power to account. The electoral cycle itself acts as a period of heightened scrutiny, during which political opponents are incentivized to uncover and publicize instances of corruption by the ruling party, further contributing to accountability. Yet, as previously noted, the very intensity of this competition can, paradoxically, also create perverse incentives for campaign finance violations and other forms of corruption. The escalating costs of modern political campaigns, particularly in large and diverse electorates, often necessitate massive fundraising efforts. This pressure can lead to an over-reliance on large donors, special interest groups, and even illicit sources of funding. Beyond direct illegal donations or quid pro quo exchanges, electoral competition can foster subtle forms of corruption, such as clientelism, where public resources are distributed selectively to secure votes, or the manipulation of information to discredit opponents rather than engage in substantive policy debates. The drive to win can also manifest in the misuse of state resources for partisan advantage, blurring the lines between government and party, or the appointment of loyal but unqualified individuals to key positions. These practices, while not always overtly illegal, undermine the integrity of the electoral process and the impartiality of public administration, ultimately eroding public trust in democratic institutions. The high stakes involved can also lead to politicians prioritizing short-term electoral gains over long-term public welfare, making difficult but necessary policy decisions politically unviable. Given these complex dynamics, a multifaceted approach to combating corruption is clearly necessary. One of the most widely advocated and implemented institutional arrangements is enhanced transparency. Transparency mechanisms that provide public access to governmental information can help constrain corruption. By making government operations, decisions, budgets, and contracts openly accessible, transparency serves several critical functions. Firstly, it increases the visibility of potential malfeasance, making it harder for corrupt actors to operate in the shadows. When contracts are publicly tendered and their awards are documented, or when government expenditures are itemized and auditable, opportunities for embezzlement or illicit kickbacks are significantly reduced. Secondly, transparency empowers citizens and civil society organizations to act as watchdogs, providing them with the necessary data to scrutinize government actions, identify irregularities, and demand accountability. Initiatives like freedom of information laws, open data portals, and public registries of beneficial ownership for companies are designed to lift the veil of secrecy that often shields corrupt practices. This public disclosure acts as a preventative measure, forcing officials to consider that their actions will be subject to public review, thus fostering greater integrity in public service. However, the efficacy of transparency is not absolute, and its limitations must be acknowledged. Transparency alone may not be sufficient when civil society lacks the capacity to monitor government effectively, or when the political culture does not support independent oversight. Simply publishing information, no matter how comprehensive, does not automatically translate into accountability. For transparency to be effective, there must be active agents capable of processing, analyzing, and acting upon the disclosed data. This requires a robust civil society equipped with investigative journalism skills, legal expertise, and the organizational capacity to advocate for change. In contexts where civil society organizations are weak, underfunded, or suppressed, or where citizens lack the digital literacy or time to engage with complex governmental data, even the most extensive transparency initiatives can fall flat. Furthermore, the political will to genuinely embrace transparency is crucial. If governments merely pay lip service to transparency, creating elaborate data portals that are difficult to navigate or publishing information in inaccessible formats, its impact will be minimal. A lack of independent media, strong rule of law, and an impartial judiciary to act on findings from transparent disclosures can also render transparency ineffective, as there is no mechanism to enforce consequences for detected corruption. Without a responsive political system and a public willing to demand accountability, transparency can remain an aspiration rather than a reality. This nuanced understanding underscores a crucial overarching point. The optimal institutional arrangements to combat corruption depend heavily on broader social conditions, technological capabilities, and existing political cultures. There is no one-size-fits-all solution or a universally applicable blueprint. What works effectively in one context, with its specific history, societal norms, and level of technological advancement, may be utterly ineffective or even counterproductive in another. For instance, in societies with high levels of digital literacy and robust internet infrastructure, digital transparency platforms and e-governance solutions can be highly impactful. In contrast, in regions with limited internet access or widespread illiteracy, community-based monitoring and traditional media might be more effective avenues for accountability. Social conditions, such as levels of trust in institutions, the prevalence of patronage networks, and the degree of social inequality, profoundly shape how anti-corruption measures are perceived and implemented. A society with deeply ingrained clientelist traditions may require a very different approach to reform than one with a strong civic tradition. Similarly, the availability of advanced technological capabilities can unlock new avenues for surveillance and detection, from big data analytics to blockchain-based transparency systems. Yet these technologies also bring their own challenges, including privacy concerns and the potential for misuse. The political culture, including the degree of executive power, the independence of the judiciary, the strength of legislative oversight, and the freedom of the press, also plays a decisive role. Institutions designed to foster accountability will struggle to function in environments where political elites are unwilling to cede power or where the rule of law is selectively applied. Therefore, Effective anti-corruption strategies must be context-specific, adaptive, and holistic. They require a comprehensive understanding of the particular drivers of corruption within a given system, recognizing that formal institutions operate within a complex web of informal norms, power dynamics, and historical legacies. This often means combining formal institutional reforms, such as electoral system adjustments, enhanced regulatory frameworks, and robust anti-corruption agencies, with broader societal interventions aimed at strengthening civil society, promoting ethical education, and fostering a culture of integrity. The interplay between these factors determines the true resilience of a system against corruption, emphasizing that institutional design is not merely a technical exercise, but a deeply political and social endeavor. Success hinges on a continuous process of evaluation, adaptation, and sustained commitment from both political leaders and an engaged citizenry to uphold the principles of public service and accountability.